as I've always underlined, the relationship between Putin and Trump is very odd and beggars serious explanation.
A lot of debate seems to be going on in the press recently of how good his English actually is. What do you know about his English capability?
He obviously speaks German better than he speaks English, but my understanding is he's actually been learning English for some years and he's actually pretty fluent in it, which of course gives him an edge, an advantage in some of these negotiations with people like Trump, who are monolinguist.
What do you make of the meeting yesterday? Who do you think actually got most out of it?
Yeah, I think describing it as a nothing burger is only true in a way from the American or the Western point of view. I think Putin got more or less everything out of it that he could have hoped for. I mean, if you look down his list of priorities as I assess them to be, whether it's avoiding secondary sanctions being imposed on countries that he's trading oil with, or whether it's keeping the Ukrainians away from the direct table of negotiations, or whether it's even creating splits between the US and Europe. And we'll come back to that in a minute. I think that it's extraordinary, actually, how much Vladimir Putin has achieved here. And what concerns me more than anything, I think, is the way in which this will bolster his position, not just in terms of strengthening his autocracy back in Russia, but in terms of dealing with the so-called global south, other countries who have been wobbling in terms of supporting Ukraine and the principles involved in Ukrainian independence. And now will have every reason to cuddle up again to Russia and to trade with Russia, with pretty much the risk of secondary sanctions being lifted.
Why do you think those sanctions haven't arrived? Let us not forget that just before this meeting was announced, there was a deadline that had just passed for Russia to comply. Otherwise, they would face severe sanctions from the US. Now, that was postponed because this meeting had been arranged. We were told repeatedly in the weeks, in the days before the meeting, that had Putin not arrived with some solid intentions of at least a ceasefire, which we didn't get from that meeting, then sanctions would follow. Everybody kept very quiet about sanctions following up from that so-called nothing burger. Why do you think we haven't seen those sanctions materialize from Trump?
I think there are a number of reasons, and I think it's important actually to distinguish between what were threatened sanctions on Russia itself, which only does about $3 billion worth of trade with America now, and the secondary sanctions which were threatened to be imposed on other states that import Russian oil, notably China, Turkey, and India, because Russian oil exports are the key to funding the war. About 30 to 40% of Russian budgetary income comes from oil export taxes. And so you can see that the threat to those countries was a big one. And those countries I know are very nervous about these secondary sanctions, which now seem to have been shelved. And I suspect the issue is, of course, wider than just the war itself. And for example, the trading relationship with China is complicated. China is one of the countries that stood up to the US and to Trump over tariffs. And the damage that China could impose retaliatory against America if such secondary sanctions were imposed could be quite significant. So I think that's another reason why Trump has moved away from that idea.
Christopher, what are you reading into the slight change in language where we're no longer talking about a ceasefire, but we're talking about a direct peace agreement? What can we read into that?
I think what we can read into it is yet again where that was a red line, supposedly, from Trump and from the European leaders, that there would be no peace settlement as such until there was a ceasefire. And so what I read into that is that Putin has persuaded Trump to change his position and to actually fall in line with the agenda of Moscow rather than the agenda of Ukraine and the European allies. And as I mentioned earlier, I think one of Putin's great objectives in all this is to create divisions within NATO and between the Europeans and America. And this now looks to me like quite a significant sticking point in that area if Trump maintains that a ceasefire is no longer the first priority.
Why do you think this is going to be a problem?
I think it's going to be a problem because essentially what Russia wants to be able to do, or Putin, is to continue on the battlefield, making incremental progress, changing the facts on the ground, as it were, whilst a peace settlement is being negotiated. No peace settlement is going to be agreed within any short period of time. Whereas if they stopped, if there was a proper ceasefire, a full ceasefire, then Russia would be obliged to stop making advances and stop changing the situation on the ground, which it thinks to its advantage right now.
Christopher, what can we read in the delegation that followed President Putin? A heavy business oriented delegation rather than a military oriented delegation. Were the Russians there to discuss something completely different outside of Ukraine?
Yes, my view of this has been for some time that actually the reason Steve Witkoff, for example, has been appointed as the envoy to Moscow is not really related to Ukraine. It's related to what we might call a broader reset of the America-Russia relationship. And that reset is, motivated, is predicated, if you like, on progress and cooperation in other areas other than Ukraine. And the overall objective would be to put Ukraine to bed, as it were, to put it on one side and to get on with all the other objectives, some of which are, as you say, business related, particularly hydrocarbons related. And I think that there's another agenda playing here. And I think probably half the conversations at this summit yesterday were about that and not about Ukraine.
Now, President Trump also said the US-Russia relations have been made more difficult by allegations of collusion. This is what he had to say to the press following the summit.
We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over.
Now, some of these allegations, of course, referred to your dossier, Christopher, and sometimes your name even pops up in conversations that Donald Trump has with the press. What did you make of what you heard from the president there?
Well, again, there's nothing new there. He's been banging on about this for years. Of course, the Russia hoax, as he calls it, was anything but. It was very clear, as the conclusion of Robert Mueller's investigation showed, that Russia tried to intervene in the 2016 US election in a sweeping and big fashion in order to assist Trump and to damage Hillary Clinton. So this is just another excuse, and it's another conspiracy theory that Trump has produced. I mean, my own role in this is, I would say, relatively minor, but it's one that Trump is obviously obsessive about. And the fact is that obviously we don't deal in fabricated intelligence or anything like that. And our role was purely to warn the US that a Russian state was hostilely attacking it and trying to influence the outcome of the election. So I think this is another theme and obsession. It's one which I'm sure Putin is playing and exploiting because he knows it's deep in Trump's heart, like some of the other things that he talks about with Trump, like the so-called fixed election in 2020, which Trump lost. So Putin's very adept at manipulating these things and playing up these things, and Trump seems to be a complete sucker for it.
Christopher, just one last question, which struck me as I was watching the footage of President Putin arriving in Alaska yesterday on the military base. It must have been an intelligence and counterintelligence nightmare for the people responsible for the protection of both presidents on the ground there. And what struck me as particularly, I found it a bit jaw-dropping, but perhaps that's my naivety. What did you make of Vladimir Putin getting into the Cadillac, the beast? This is the sort of the enclave where the president is at his most vulnerable, and it's the most protection offered to the president. That Cadillac travels across the globe to protect the president. I would have assumed that Putin's people would have had to have a look at the beast before they allowed him to get in it. What does that tell us about the intelligence and counterintelligence that must have gone on yesterday?
Well, it tells us that we're dealing with a very unorthodox president who doesn't follow security protocols. And we've seen that in his administration earlier in the year when the so-called signal Hegseth scandal broke out, if you remember,
Yeah.
about the details of a bombing run on Yemen, I think it was, being shared around on a Signal group, a commercially available app. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I just think that it was yet another case of Putin exploiting the moment in order to rub in the fact that he was, being treated as an equal, being treated in a way that no other world leader would be treated, despite the fact he's a pariah and actually an indicted war criminal.
What was
So
it a
is an
security risk, though, putting him or letting his people get so close to something that is highly sensitive?
Yes, I'm sure it was. And as I say, Trump does not obey security protocols when he travels around and deals with other world leaders. And this must be a nightmare for the people around him, because the US has the sort of strongest and most expensive secure systems and protection and so on of any country. So it is a bizarre event. And the whole thing was bizarre. The fact that Trump was literally clapping Putin down the red carpet, apart from being nauseating, to actually explain that and to put it in some sort of context is really quite difficult. And I think that, as I've always underlined, the relationship between Putin and Trump is very odd and beggars serious explanation.
Christophe Steele, thank you so much for giving us your time. Always good to talk. They're former head of the Russian desk at MI6.